Hello, my name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've joined us here today. I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and we honor a hero and a rescuer named Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who in the spring of 1940 saved thousands of lives against the explicit orders of his government, and he was harshly punished. For the past year and a half, we've been holding programs on Sundays. Many of you have been regularly attending them, for which I'm very grateful. And we've been focusing on different figures in Jewish history or different heroes and resistance, rescue and resistance heroes of the Holocaust and other periods of history. Today, we're stepping back in time to the early 20th century and late 19th century. We're focusing on a figure whose name is commonly known, but most people don't know anything about him, and that is the figure of Theodor Herzl, who launched a country. How many people can say that they did that? So today we have three experts who are going to give you three totally different perspectives on this man. I'm going to tell you about them in the order in which they will be speaking. We're going to start with Shulamit Reinharz, who's a sociologist from Brandeis University. She's a professor emeritus, and she is going to be focusing on Herzl and his family, the family dynamics of the Herzl family. She's going to basically start by taking him off his pedestal. And then our two other speakers will put him back on his pedestal, and you'll learn more details about who he was and what he did that was so extraordinary. Our second speaker is Derek Penslar, who is Herzl's biographer. He's a professor of history at Harvard University, and he's the author of Theodor Herzl, the Charismatic Leader, that just came out in 2020. It's a brand new book, and it's about to come out in German translation. So I'm thrilled to have Professor Penslar with us as our second speaker. And third, but not last, is the subject of the film that you all saw. David Matlow, he's coming to us from Toronto, Canada. And he is the world's foremost collector of Herzl memorabilia. And he will tell us about his collection, how he got involved, and more about the film that you all saw. So let's start with our talks. And Shula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to speak about one of the most interesting figures in history. As Olivia said, I will be focusing on the family and not talking about his achievements. Tolstoy's great novel, Anna Karenina, opens with the famous sentence, "Happy families are all alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." In the case of the Herzls, I would modify the sentence to read, "Most unhappy families are unhappy in a few ways, but the Herzl family was unhappy in every way." Theodor Herzl's family suffered from the early deaths of all of its members. Only one reached the age of 49. The causes of these deaths included suicides, illnesses, and even murder by the Nazis. Beyond the deaths was the problem of the quality of their lives. In fact, a 2005 article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz stated that, quote, "Theodor Herzl's marriage was one of history's most notoriously unhappy unions," close quote. Here you have a picture of Herzl's family of origin. He is obviously standing on the left side of your screen, and his sister Pauline is seated. She was 1 year older than he, and he loved her dearly. There were only 2 children in the family. So let's begin with Pauline. Pauline died at the age of 19 from typhus, prompting the family to leave their home in Budapest and move to Vienna. Theodor was 18 at the time. Could I have the slide? Next slide, please. In Vienna, Theodor's parents, Jeanette and Jacob, befriended the Naschauer family, one of the Nassauer daughters, Julie, married Theodor when he was 30 and she 21. I sometimes wonder if Theodor and Julie, whom you will see in a minute, were actually related. An inbred marriage might explain why Julie and Theodor's 3 children were severely mentally disturbed, although, as we will see, Julie and Theodor themselves had profound psychological problems. Next slide, please. The marriage started out in a distorted way because Julie had an enormous dowry, $1.25 million in today's valuation. She wanted to use this fortune to maintain the lavish lifestyle to which she was accustomed, and that did not interest Herzl at all. Here you see Julie Nassauer and a picture of Herzl when he was much older. During the first year of their marriage, Julie gave birth to a daughter they named Paulina in memory of Theodor's deceased sister. Paulina suffered from debilitating mental illness, multiple degrading relationships with men when she became an adult, and severe drug addiction. She died of an overdose in 1930 at the age of 40 and left no children. Theodor himself was a moody, difficult young man. In Julie, he found a kindred spirit. He described his wife as mercurial, given to fits of rage, a profligate spender, and prone to making theatrical threats of suicide by hanging or poison. According to one of his doctors, Theodor himself was suicidal, but he probably never made an actual attempt. Julie and Theodor were trapped in the familiar quandary of not being able to live with each other and not agreeing to divorce. Herzl found some solace in his writing and then later in his role as the preeminent Zionist leader of his time. Being the founder of political Zionism both saved him from his dreadful marriage and exacerbated it. We could say that just as Herzl saved the Jewish people via Zionism, so too Zionism saved him, at least for a while. Some of Herzl's admirers fantasized that Herzl had a good marriage, claiming that they found affectionate letters he wrote to his wife. But the truth is otherwise. In fact, soon after their marriage, Theodor wrote to Julie, quote, "We're not suitable for each other. What interests and fulfills me leaves you cold and estranged," close quote. As early as 3 months after Paulina's birth, Theodor wrote to his parents about leaving Julie. Then, during a brief reconciliation, Julie became pregnant again, this time with a son, Hans. Hans, unfortunately, was never able to find a direction for his life, and he later sought solace by converting to baptism and then Catholicism. At age 39, Hans shot himself to death on the day of his sister Paulina's funeral. That was the firstborn, leaving a request that he be buried in her coffin with her. From the start, Julie and Theodor also involved their parents in their unsatisfying marriage. Theodor even sent, quote, "a list of complaints and demands" to his father-in-law, close quote, including the accusation that Julie displayed loveless, hurtful conduct towards his own parents. In turn, his letter accused Julie's parents of, quote, "having reared a crass, spoiled, and empty-headed daughter," close quote. Julie and Theodor involved their children in their troubles, likely contributing to the children's psychological problems. For example, one time when Theodor asked Julie for a divorce, he said she could take Paulina, but he wanted Hans. Can you imagine the impact on Paulina of knowing this? Theodor's misery spilled into his attempt to create a career as a playwright. He blamed Julie for his inability to work and for making him disappoint his own parents. Only when he left his wife and children on extended trips was he able to write. His first topic was a biography of his best friend who just had committed suicide. Herzl's work habits reflected his manic depressive personality. The rejection of his plays, for example, reduced him to utter despair, followed by a period of creative frenzy. Even when he was not traveling, Theodor and Julie spent very little quality time together since Herzl worked 14 to 16 hours a day. Yet another attempt at reconciliation produced a plan that the family, including Herzl's parents, move into a magnificent apartment in Paris. Combining the generations in this way was a very bad idea because, as Derek Penslar wrote, the dynamic between Julie and Jeanette, Herzl's mother, was quote unquote poisonous. One of the few photos of Julie and Theodor together shows them sitting next to his mother, forming a terrible triangle. There's the terrible triangle. I don't know which one looks unhappier than the next. 2 years after Hans's birth, the Herzls had a third child, whom they called by the nickname Trude. Like her two siblings, Hans and Paulina, Trude suffered from depression and periodically was admitted to psychiatric institutions. Let's see their children. There they are. That's the three of them with Herzl and a donkey. And here's another one. Hans looks very strange, and as does, I think, the rest of them. Theodor's mother, Jeanette, and her son were very close, perhaps too much so, provoking anger between Jeanette and her daughter-in-law, Julie. Could we have the next one? Here is Jeanette and Theodor in his study. They were close, literally. Theodor's father and Theodor were also close, with Jacob serving him as a kind of secretary who copied Theodor's sloppy notes into legible, coherent sentences. In 1902, when Herzl was 42, his beloved father died. 2 years later, in 1904, Herzl himself succumbed. He was only 44. At the time of his death, he had been married to Julie for only 14 years. An earlier infection with a venereal disease, his destructive marriage, his overwork, and perhaps his genetic inheritance led to an ambiguously defined heart disease that kept Theodor in bed for weeks on end. He died exhausted. Julie died only 3 years later in 1907 at age 39. By this point, she had become bankrupt as a consequence of Theodor using all of their money for his Zionist activities. Zionist leaders responded to her constant requests and created a fund to help her. Grazia Deledda, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, visited Herzl and wrote, "I saw him in his home beside his beautiful wife. It became clear to me in a moment that Julie found only torment in that which was his life and fate. It was only then that I understood the full tragedy of his life," close quote. In his biography of Herzl, The Labyrinth of Exile, historian Ernest Powell explains, quote, "Julie shared none of her husband's interests and came actively to resent his total involvement with Zionism. Her embarrassingly outspoken hostility to the movement was widely known. Julie could have played the first lady to Herzl's King of the Jews, but she wanted none of it. She was not unique. Many women married to extraordinary history-shaping men take no interest in their husbands' activities and are intensely disliked by the public." Julie's hostility towards the Zionist movement was so uncomfortable for Zionist leaders that they attempted to create a fictional Julie Herzl after her death. For example, the headline of her obituary in the Yiddish newspaper Yiddisches Tageblatt called her passing, quote, "a great tragedy among Zionists," close quote. The article explains, "They lived a short but happy life. She often assisted her husband in his work. She also had a great interest in Zionism, even though she never attended the Zionist congresses," close quote. Even worse, after Theodor's death, a statement attributed to Julie was published in the Jewish Chronicle, which Pavel says was obviously written for her rather than by her. It read, quote, "Theodor's work was and will ever remain sacred to me. I will serve the Zionist movement with all my strength and will do everything possible to initiate my children into the work of their father and to make them worthy champions of the movement for the deliverance of our people for which he strove," close quote. Powell empathizes with her, however. She probably deserves far more credit than she ever got for her candor, courage, and adaptability, as well as credit for a certain native intelligence, which neither her background nor her marital life ever gave her a chance to develop. Close quote. I am not convinced. The creators of an opera about them, titled The State of the Jews, depicts Julie, quote, in the most sympathetic rendering we can muster, close quote. Their point of view is, quote, that hers is a hidden and largely forgotten voice that deserves to be heard along Theodor's, close quote. Again, I am not convinced. Next one, please. There is one more very sad story to be told. As I mentioned earlier, Theodor and Julie had a third child, a daughter, Trude. She later married a man 27 years her senior, with whom she had a son, whose name was Stefan Theodor Norman Neumann, and here's a picture of him. In 1943, the Nazis deported Trude, Stephen's mother, along with other patients in Avid's hospital to Theresienstadt, where she perished. Trude's husband was on the same transport from Vienna and died 2 months later in the camp. Stephen Norman was not killed in the Holocaust and might have become Herzl's heir. Born in 1918, he left anti-Semitic Austria for England in 1935. In England, he read extensively about his grandfather, Theodor Herzl, and adopted a Zionist outlook. Later, he joined the British military, and in early 1946, he visited Palestine to, quote, see what my grandfather had started, close quote. Stephen was positively impressed by Palestine and wrote, I will return, but he did not. Back in England, Chaim Weizmann resented Stephen's using his family relations to dabble in Zionist politics. Perhaps for this reason, Stephen left England for the United States to take a position with the British mission in Washington, D.C. It was only then that he learned about his parents' fate in Theresienstadt. He became profoundly depressed that he had not been able to help them or assist the Jewish people who were now living in the DP camps. On November 26, 1946, Stephen committed suicide by jumping from a bridge in Washington, D.C. at age 28. He was buried in the nation's capital and then reinterred near his grandfather in Jerusalem after many years. A year and a half after Stephen's death, the state of Israel was born, and Herzl would become revered as the father of the Jewish state, a father with no descendants of his own. I see people shaking their heads. I'm very sorry to deliver the bad news. I was even going to give you a trigger warning, but I just had to tell the truth. And now we go to Derek Penslar, who's going to tell you about what Herzl was able to accomplish despite all of this. Derek.
Thank you, Shula, and thank you for that presentation. It is true that Herzl was a troubled man, as Shula so well pointed out, but he did accomplish great things, and not necessarily in spite of those troubles, but perhaps because of them. Because like a lot of human beings who are great, who have qualities of greatness, of leadership, and who are truly heroic, yes, Herzl was a troubled person. So let's focus on the other side of that coin, that Herzl was a successful leader. Yes, he was a narcissist. Yes, he may have been manic depressive, but he had an innate charisma. Now, charisma alone does not make a person a great leader. Charisma, there are great leaders who are not charismatic, and there are charismatics who are not great leaders. But as we think about some of the greatest figures in the 20th century, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Mohandas Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah of Pakistan, Martin Luther King Jr., the list goes on and on. Charisma certainly was an important factor behind their ability to gain a following, particularly for anti-colonial leaders or for leaders of stateless nations where they have no bureaucracy, no party machinery, nothing to draw upon. It's just themselves. And Herzl very much was a man coming into a movement that barely existed. He did not found the Zionist movement, but he augmented it enormously. Could I have the next slide, please? Herzl, like a lot of great charismatics, was aware from a very early age that he had a certain power. He had a commanding presence, and he used it. Here we see him on the far left as a young man. When he was only 14 in high school in Budapest, he founded a literary society called Wir, or We, of which he was, not surprisingly, president, self-proclaimed president. And his power for being a commanding leader type figure continued through his adolescence. And it's true, there was a brief period of time where he was a rather undistinguished attorney in Austria. Here we see him second from the right with his mutton chops. I don't think anybody would recognize that picture as Herzl. But he got to Paris in 1891 as a journalist, and not just any journalist, but the Paris correspondent of the most prestigious newspaper in the German-speaking world, the Neue Freie Presse. And here, this is where Herzl grew the beard. Now, at this point still, Herzl just looks like a nice-looking man. But if we can have the next slide, please. We see Herzl turning into something else during his Paris years. First, cultivating the air of a man about town. The beard gets a bit longer, his appearance gets a bit more raffish and yet dignified at the same time. And not long after he does turn to Zionism in 1895, he begins to cultivate a different appearance even still. We see him here with the beard is getting longer and the eyes that we saw in his children, those deep, piercing, sad eyes. Now, Herzl was himself, as we saw, as Shula said, a troubled man and a sad man. And yet he also knew of the sense or the impression that he made on people as a symbol of their own suffering and their own longings, as we see in the next slide. So here we see the famous photograph of Herzl taken by the artist Ephraim Lillian in Basel at the Three Kings Hotel. And here is Herzl. I mean, this is a cultivated, perhaps staged photograph in order to communicate Herzl's gravity of bearing and the effect he had on the Zionist movement as a prophet figure, and then with his early death, or from cardiomyopathy, as a martyr to the Jewish people. And again, this is something Herzl, like other leaders, cultivated. But Herzl was more than a pretty face. He was also a great writer. Herzl had a talent with words. He was not a great playwright, a good one, but not a great one. He was a great journalist. He could communicate an idea quickly, cleanly, powerfully. When he wrote his pamphlet, The State of the Jews, in 1896, okay, it wasn't a bestseller, but for those who read it in clear, cool, unemotional language, he laid out the problems that the Jews faced and then devoted himself to the various political and economic means with which to solve the problems. What made him particularly effective as a communicator of ideas was his journalism. Herzl was a highly successful communicator of Zionist ideas through the newspaper he founded called The World, or Die Welt, in 1897. And in many speeches, columns that he wrote for other newspapers, Herzl was able to communicate the ideas of Zionism effectively. He was a spellbinding orator at the Zionist congresses. And although he never was allowed to write about Zionism in his Viennese newspaper, Die Neue Freie Presse, the fact that he was a journalist for that newspaper gave him a huge amount of clout in the Jewish world. He was one of Europe's most famous journalists, and he knew everyone. So he was able to reach large numbers of people. Next slide, please. Herzl fashioned himself, as we saw, but he also was a playwright, and in a way he fashioned the Jewish people. So here we see the famous morning session of the late summer of 1897, the opening session of the Zionist Congress in Basel. And it's not just Herzl who looks like $1 million. He has everyone wearing evening dress, formal dress, to impress upon them the dignity, the gravity of the occasion. So Herzl, the playwright, Herzl, the journalist, again, fashioning himself and fashioning the Jewish nation. Okay, so far we've talked about Herzl as a pretty face and as a man who knows how to reach people with his oratory and his writing. but he also was a man of action. Shula referred to his indefatigable work ethic. He was also a very good organizer. He had a talent for persuading people to do things they might not want to do, for effecting compromises, for bringing people together. He was able to found the Zionist congresses and run them. It was not an easy thing to manage these large biennial gatherings or annual gatherings in his own lifetime of the Jewish people. He founded the Zionist organization, which effectively became a proto-government of what would become eventually a Jewish state. He founded a Zionist bank in 1898. It didn't raise a lot of money, but symbolically it had huge power. And he was one of the founders of the Jewish National Fund. So Herzl was a very effective administrator and organizer, and he was a clever strategist, a political a tactician, really, managing the various factions in the Zionist movement that did not like each other very much. Orthodox Jews versus secular Jews, socialist Zionists versus bourgeois Zionists. Herzl compared it to having eggs in his hands, that he was always throwing eggs up in the air and trying not to drop any of them and break them. And he was very effective at this. And this explains why Herzl had many rivals, but no peers. No one had his combination of his physical appearance, his charisma, his effective communication skills, his administrative skills. But there were men who were jealous of him and who looked down on him. Menachem Ussishkin, Russian Zionist leader, thought Herzl was a Jewish ignoramus, which more or less Herzl was. But Ussishkin did not have Herzl's administrative power. He did not have his communication skills. Similarly, a great figure in Hebrew literature named Asher Ginsburg, his pen name was Ahad Ha'am, or one of the people. He was extremely critical of Herzl and the Zionist movement, but was incapable of coming up with any sensible or serious alternatives. The joke about Ahad Ha'am is that if he beheld Achilles, he would only see his heel. And then there was Natan Birnbaum on the right, who actually discovered Herzl. He was a Viennese figure who, when Herzl became a Zionist, invited Herzl to speak to Jewish students in Vienna and really helped give Herzl his first entry into the Zionist world. But Birnbaum was a jealous man who really wanted to take over the Zionist movement, and he hated being in the shadows of Herzl. He wound up leaving the movement altogether and eventually became a leader of the anti-Zionist Orthodox Agudas Yisrael. So Herzl had, again, rivals, but no peers. Next slide. Moving towards the end, Herzl had great accomplishments in his life, but not everything worked. Herzl tried very hard not only to reach the masses, but to reach the elites, like the wealthiest Jews in the world who could bankroll the Zionist enterprise, like Maurice de Hirsch, here pictured, or the Rothschild banking family. They laughed him off. They thought that the Zionist idea was foolhardy, if not downright dangerous, because it would endanger the status of Jews in lands where they are oppressed or simply tolerated. It might give aid and comfort to anti-Semites who say that Jews are not really part of the countries in which they live. So they dismissed it. Next slide, please. Herzl met 5 times with the Ottoman Emperor Abdulhamid II in an attempt to win a charter for mass settlement of Jews in Palestine. In New York English, forget about it. There was no way that the Ottoman Sultan was ever going to hand over Palestine to the Zionists, although they were willing to play Herzl along in order to see if he could get them loans or other ways of helping pay down their enormous government debt. Herzl also met a couple of times with the German emperor, whom Herzl absolutely adored, hoping that the Kaiser would establish a German protectorate over Palestine. And again, Wilhelm toyed with the idea. He was himself quite an anti-Semite, and he loved the idea of getting the Jews out of Europe. But this was simply geopolitically impossible as long as the Ottoman Empire stood. So Herzl's diplomatic negotiations, for the most part, were not terribly successful. And yet he did have a bit of success, at least with the British government, which offered the Jews some kind of settlement in East Africa, in what is today the country of Kenya, and back then was called Uganda. But ultimately, it was not the substance of Herzl's diplomatic ventures that made him into a great Zionist hero. It was the symbol, the symbolic value of Herzl meeting with the German emperor, the Ottoman emperor, the Pope, the King of Bulgaria, the King of Italy. Herzl appeared to Jews the world over as a prince of Egypt who had come from assimilation, discovered his people, and was able to consort with the greatest and most powerful leaders of the world. Even in his own lifetime, he was mythologized, as we see from this painting on the left, and about which David can tell us more. And here we see him in death, remembered and mythologized as a great martyr for the Jewish people. And the final slide, I just wanted to mention to you that in 1921, David will talk about this more, a wonderful silent film was made, historically as inaccurate as the depictions of Julie Herzl's Zionist enthusiasm that Shula talked about, and yet a film with great power in terms of explaining what Herzl meant to the Jewish people in the years and decades after his death. So all of these things together, I think, help account for Herzl's greatness as a leader. But to talk more about the aura of the material objects that Herzl left behind and that have been created in Herzl's memory, we have David Matlow.
Thanks so much, Derek, and for shedding light on Herzl's charisma. The poster for today's session is a picture by the artist David Harel from Jerusalem, and maybe we can put that up. I'm a collector of Herzl memorabilia, which you will have seen from the movie. My wife is a collector of pomegranates, so my collection takes up most of the house. You see it behind me, and my wife's collection of pomegranates takes up a few shelves, but this is a piece that we share in both our collections. And it's really an honor to be on the same program as Professors Penslar and Reinharz. It reminds me of the Sesame Street song, "One of these things doesn't go with the other." My Herzl movie, which you've seen, and the poster of it is on the left, is part of the Herzl Project. It's my one-person initiative whose purpose is to inform people about what Herzl did and inspire people to be a little bit about Herzl, be a bit like Herzl. The film and my collection more generally have taken me to amazing places. One of those places, as you saw in the film, was Basel, where I celebrated my 50th birthday. And another place is the Herzl School of Excellence, which I will discuss in a few minutes. My Herzl, the film, was made with Jerusalem filmmaker Eli Tal-El. It was not the first film or theatrical project about Herzl. On the left is the poster from the movie that Derek mentioned. It was a silent film made in 1921 with it's about an hour in length. And this poster on the left, and everything you'll see is from my collection, is the poster when the movie went to Latvia for distribution in 1925. And on the right is the playbill from a production of Herzl, the play, which ran in 1976 for all of 8 shows. There are many more related items in my collection about operas, plays, musicals. Professor Reinharz mentioned State of the Jews and Opera, which premiered in New York about 3 years ago. And more such productions are in process all of the time. As we heard from Derek, Herzl had charisma. He was a superstar. And this is the picture that Professor Penslar showed in his presentation about Herzl on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel in Basel. You will have seen in the movie me standing in this very spot. But what's interesting about this picture is look right under the picture, it's signed by Herzl. People went up to Herzl and asked him to autograph his picture, like one would with an athlete or a movie star. I have 5,000 items in my collection. The sheer number of items is reflective of his importance. And I have items of all kinds. In the top right is one sample shelf in my collection. You will see medals and coins, busts, awards. The top left, an ice tong, a fork and spoon set, a jewelry box, 2 different pen knives, 2 different pocket watches, and it would go on and on, but I too am limited to 12 minutes. Some of the items in my collection are of very fine art. For instance, before you are 2 Bezalel pieces. To the right is a Herzl that was fashioned in the early 1910s, colored with quotes from Herzl on the rim. And on the left is a missile case. So this was left over from the British Army when they conquered Palestine in 1917. People went to retrieve the missile cases, and this is a Bezalel rendering of Herzl on this case. So this is high art from the Bezalel school. But some of the Herzl items in my collection are very pedestrian. Here are Herzl pencils that are made in Czechoslovakia. And of course, if you wanted to sell shoe polish, who would you think to put on the tin of shoe polish but Herzl himself? This is a Bulgarian brand of shoe polish, Maccabee brand. And so the hostess holding up the tin of shoe polish, in the middle you see a close-up, and that is Herzl, and to the right is the version of the tin which is in the bottom right-hand corner of the poster. It's Herzl with some kind of fabricated sort of looking Hebrew language, but it is definitely Herzl on the tin of shoe polish. And my all-time favorite is Herzl brand of sardines. This is a brand of sardines that was sold or was canned in the Oriental Fisheries Company in Chicago of Norwegian sardines. But if you can believe it, there were 2 competing brands of Herzl sardines. There was a brand of Herzl sardines that was sold in Palestine in the 1930s, which included Portuguese sardines. And as you saw in the film, my most favorite and special piece in my collection is this one. It's called a carnet de bal, which is a ladies' dance locket. This locket belonged to Fanny Wolfson, who was the wife of David Wolfson. David Wolfson was Herzl's successor when he died in 1904. And to me, it's the Zionist equivalent to a 1927 New York Yankees signed baseball. It has the signatures of all the prominent Zionists. Mrs. Wolfson wore this locket to all the balls and galas. They had fancy fundraisers in the early Zionist period, like we did before the pandemic and like we'll come back. And this, so it has Israel Zangwill, Max Nordau, Katz Nelson, all kinds of people. And on the top is Herzl, his Hebrew name, Binyamin Zev Herzl, and that's his signature, Benjamin. His charisma, which Professor Penslar talked about, clearly outlived him. Herzl is still relevant, and let's look at but one example of many of the ongoing relevance of Herzl today. And I'll take you to the Herzl School, which we saw in the earlier slide, which is in North Lawndale, which is in Western Chicago. In 1915, North Lawndale was like the Lower East Side, the seat of Jewry in Chicago. There were 100 synagogues within a 1-mile radius. And in 1915, the Chicago public school system was building a new school, a very large school, as you see in the picture on the top left. And the Jewish community asked the Chicago public school system whether they would name it after Herzl, and they did. So in 1915, the Theodor Herzl School was established as a public school, not as a Jewish day school. And I discovered it when this sticker, which you see on the right for the Herzl Junior College Huskies, popped up on eBay. And if it has the word Herzl on it, it qualifies for my collection. So I bought it and I tried to find out what the Herzl School was, and it took me to North Lawndale. And when my Herzl was invited to participate in the Chicago Festival of Israeli Cinema, the filmmaker Eli Tal-El and I visited the school. So since 1915, the population of the community has changed from being Jewish to now it's 92% Black and 8% Hispanic, yet the school is still named after Herzl. The students wear uniforms with Herzl on it. Their school team is the Herzl Bears, and you can see to the right what's in the gymnasium, and this was a t-shirt that was one of the students was wearing the day that we went to visit. And Ellie and I spoke to the kids about Herzl, because until we visited, they really didn't know who Herzl was, even though his name appeared on their shirts and sports teams. So we explained who Herzl was. The Chicago Festival of Israeli Cinema kindly invited the grade 8 class to see the movie in a suburban mall. And annually, I've gone back and with my family, with friends, with others, to each year until the pandemic, talk to the new grade 8 students about who Herzl is. And from these meetings, the relationship broadened so that the Jewish community of Chicago has started to pair with the school, especially Temple Beth Israel in Skokie, who annually brings school supplies and Christmas gifts to all the students. It's Herzl that brought this community and the Jewish community of Chicago together. And that's because we all share dreams. We share the same dream. This gentleman to the left is Aviv Ezra. He was the former Consul General of Israel to Chicago and Western United States. And he came on a day where the students of the Herzl School and Temple Beth Israel traveled together through the neighborhood to learn about the Jewish roots of the community. And to the right is bracelets that we prepared, and I wear one every day, which shows the similarity of the dreams of all communities, which is Herzl's motto, Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you will it, it is no dream. And of course, the famous statement of Martin Luther King Jr. In his speech at the Lincoln Memorial of I Have a Dream. And these students learn to live up to the ideals of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Herzl. When Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago in 1965 to work on inequality in housing, he moved to a house that was 2 blocks away from the Herzl School. So these two charismatic and important leaders overlap in this place. And from Herzl, the students learn about the pursuit of social justice, that conditions can improve, that education is the key to changing your future. And all of this starts at the top with the school principal, Tamara Davis. In one of our visits, Tamara said her dream is to have a portrait of Herzl on the wall of the auditorium. And my wife, Leanne, was with me that day, and she said, fantastic. If we can get another piece of junk out of the house, let's do it. And so this on the left is the portrait, and this was the unveiling of the portrait. That's me and a representative of the Israeli consulate. And in this auditorium, to this day, there are 2 portraits, Herzl on one side and Martin Luther King Jr. on the other side. And the picture on the right is Principal Davis, who earlier this year talked to a meeting of the American Zionist movement. There were over 100 leaders of the American Zionist organizations across the panorama of ideologies. And Principal Davis talked about what the students of the Herzl School share, how Herzl continues to inspire the students to dream and to work towards a better tomorrow. So Herzl's work continues to have meaning in places where we might not expect. He's still important. His charisma still inspires. The movie My Herzl, which you saw, is part of the Herzl Project, and more details of the Herzl Project are available on the website, the link to which is below. And the point of the project is to inspire people to make their dreams happen and to work towards completing Herzl's dream, which is a world free of anti-Semitism, a world where heroes like Aristides Sousa Mendes are no longer needed, and a Jewish state living in peace as a model society that benefits all people. I'll now pass it back to Livia.
Wow. I thoroughly enjoyed all three of those presentations, and my mind is exploding. So I encourage everyone in the audience to put your questions into the chat box. There are already a couple of questions that have started accumulating. Right now, let me briefly tell you about our upcoming programs, and that'll give you a moment to gather your thoughts and formulate your questions. So we have 4 programs left in 2021. Next week, we are taking our series back to our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, whom David just mentioned. We're showing a brand new film called The Legacy of Aristides. We'll have the filmmaker himself with us, Patrick Serodi. He's going to join us from France. We have Sousa Mendes's grandson, Gerald Mendes, who will be also joining us from France. And we have Cookie Fisher, whose mother was a Sousa Mendes visa recipient, joining us from Portugal. And both Gerald and Cookie are in the film, as I am as well. You'll learn about my own family story and the work of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So I'm absolutely thrilled to present this to you next week. It's a free program. There's room for 1,000 people on our Zoom account. We want it full. So please invite everyone you know. The following 2 Sundays are programs about Italy, about the Jewish community of Italy. The first program, which is in 2 weeks' time, is about Italian Jews in Italy, and in specific, the town of Pitigliano, which rescued its Jewish population during World War II, a town in Tuscany. Beautiful town that's nicknamed Little Jerusalem because it looks like a little Jerusalem. It's quite lovely. And the following week, we're focusing on Italian Jews who came as refugees to the United States, and how they didn't fit in with other Italian refugees because they were not Catholic, and they didn't fit in with the Jewish community in the US. They didn't speak Yiddish, they weren't Ashkenazi, so they were their own little community, and that will be quite interesting to learn about. Then our final program of the year will be in 4 weeks' time, December 5th, and there we will meet a real live modern day hero. Her name is Judy Feld-Carr. She's going to be interviewed by Shulamit Reinharz, whom we've just met. And Judy Feld-Carr is really inspirational. She did something monumental, which is that over a period of 28 years, she worked in secret to rescue the Jews of Syria. And she rescued 3,200 human beings during that time period. It's an extraordinary thing she did. You'll meet her in person. We also have music. It'll be a very festive and very informational and very inspirational program. So look for details about that. So now let's get to your questions. So there's a question for you, David, and that is, what are your plans for your unbelievable collection?
So thank you for the question. That's one of the most asked questions of me. It would be my privilege, my honor to make the collection available to any place that would show it, that would exhibit it. I believe it's a national treasure of the Jewish people that's here in my home, and people come to use it. Professor Penslar came for a few days to do some research for his book, but it belongs in libraries, it belongs in museums. So if there's anyone out there that has a plan for it, I welcome it. It needs to be exhibited. If it's going to sit in boxes, I say it might as well sit in boxes here. But if someone is prepared to exhibit and use it and make it available for learning and inspiration, it would be my pleasure to make it available. And that's something that I do need to work on over the next, God willing, 60 years.
Okay. So there's a question about what seems to be a turning point in history, which is when Herzl witnesses the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus in Paris. So can somebody explain more about that event and how it changed Herzl? Or maybe that's a myth. Maybe he already was thinking along those lines. Who would like to answer that? Professor Penslar, maybe?
Sure. It's a really tough question because it's so enshrined or ingrained in the way people think about Herzl. So the first question is what really happened? And the second question is why do we have the story about the Dreyfus affair? Well, there's no evidence whatsoever. There's no direct evidence that the Dreyfus affair turned Herzl into being a Zionist from the actual time of the Dreyfus trial. That is, if you look at Herzl's newspaper reportage and what he wrote in his diary and what he wrote in letters, there's nothing from 1894, 95, 96 at all. Dreyfus doesn't even appear in his writings until the end of 1896, by which time he's already a full-fledged Zionist. And so the question is, why do people think that the Dreyfus affair made him to a Zionist? And the answer is that Herzl said so in 1899. He wrote an essay in 1899 that the affair turned him into a Zionist. So what's going on? It is possible that he just left behind no records whatsoever in those years in the mid-1890s. But was harboring this all along. That's possible. It's possible that he fabricated this story in 1899 because the Dreyfus affair was a global phenomenon. And to tie this global crisis into the origins of Zionism, as it were, raises the status of Zionism. It's possible, and I think most likely, that he misremembered. For example, Herzl claimed that the Dreyfus trial influenced his writing of his play, The New Ghetto, which is about a Jew discovering his identity and insisting on fighting and dying as a Jew. Herzl registered that play with the Copyright Office in Vienna 3 weeks before Dreyfus was arrested. So memory plays tricks with us, and we don't necessarily have to fabricate to get things wrong. There's so much evidence from the mid-1890s that Herzl was terrified with what was going on in Vienna, his beloved Vienna, with now a populist, demagogue, charismatic, anti-Semitic mayor, Karl Lueger. This really, I think, got to him. And he'd been agonized by anti-Semitism and thinking about how to respond to it for a few years beforehand. So, of course, the Dreyfus affair may have influenced him, but there's absolutely no evidence from the time itself to suggest as much.
If I can just add something.
Please.
What Derek said also occurred with Chaim Weizmann. A lot of people do this. Chaim Weizmann said that he went to Kishinev at the time of the Kishinev pogroms. He didn't. And I don't know if he misremembered, as Derek so graciously said, or if he did it on purpose, but I have an interesting hypothesis, I think, interesting to me at least. All of these great leaders in the world had people helping them, like an individual secretary or an almost great person working with them. And those people saw it as their task, not just to help the person and to record what was going on, but to start to create the image that that person would have. So Meyer Weiskal, who was Chaim Weizmann's, let's say, right-hand man, created all sorts of stories about Weizmann that are not true. And as I told you before, you saw that the Zionist movement created all sorts of images to enhance Julie's attitude so that she would not look like a critic of Zionism. So Derek, I totally respect and understand and appreciate what you said. I just want to say that we should not blame Herzl for being unique in this way.
Yeah.
I mean, do any of us ever say we did something great that we actually didn't?
So there seems to be so much myth making around this figure of Herzl. and the fact that his image just proliferates. I mean, what a fascinating character. I'm wondering if one or more of you can speak a little bit about the state of Israel and its role in this myth making and what it means to the meaning of the state.
Why don't you start, Shula?
Well, I was going to tell a joke instead. Is that okay, Olivia? When my younger daughter was 6, we spent the year in Israel, and she went to what's called Kita Aleph, first grade, where they begin to learn the myth of Herzl. And all the children from her first grade went to see Herzl's grave and probably heard some unusual stories about him, etc. And if you don't know any Hebrew, this won't be funny for you, but so when she came home that day from her field trip to see the grave of Herzl, I said to her, "Oh, it's so nice. What was Herzl's first name?" And she said, "Har." The word har means mount. So she thought that Har Herzl was his name. I only mention this because you get a little error like that, and that could be proliferated. Maybe all the kids thought it was Har, and then somehow told it to somebody else. So the proliferation of errors, the desire to create a hero. In Israel, I don't think anybody doesn't know the name Herzl. Many people don't know the name Weizmann. Most towns have a Herzl Street, an avenue. It would be like Washington Street here. He is really compared to Washington as the founder of the country. And you got to keep those myths alive. Otherwise, you don't know how to talk about the founding of your country. Nobody talks about his horrible family. I'm using that word horrible with sympathy. And people really don't talk about his foibles very much. They talk about his great idea, and it was a great idea. And the idea basically was assimilation will not allow the Jews to thrive. And everybody thought that was the way to do it. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people thought that was the way to do it. And he came from an assimilated family. And he said the only way to do it is to be self-governing, to be our own place. That was such a radical idea that no matter what anyone discovers about Herzl, he will always be remembered as a great man.
Derek, what would you like to say in closing to our audience?
Well, I would just say that Herzl, like in Israel today, there are many Herzls. That is, I agree that everybody in Israel has heard of him, if only because every city has a street named after him. And the name is ubiquitous, but I think he's become a meme. He's become a signifier or a symbol, but the question is, what does he signify? So if you're a left-winger in Israel today, Herzl symbolizes things David was talking about: social justice, freedom, liberty, and not just for Jews. That Herzl was a man who, after all, was a liberal, and who talked in his novel, Old New Land. He talks about taking the technology developed in the new Jewish homeland to cure malaria and to cure diseases in Africa, for the development of Black Africa. So the left sees him also as a supporter of Jewish-Arab reconciliation, because there's one of the major characters in his novel is an Arab character, a Palestinian Arab. But the right wing in Israel today has an entirely different Herzl. They see him in terms of his staunch nationalism, his insistence on the failure of Jewish life in the diaspora, that Jews can only trust other Jews, which is exactly the opposite of what Herzl believed. Herzl believed that Jews will be part of an international community that will respect them and in which they will play a constructive role. But so Herzl is ubiquitous in Israel. But the question is, what does he mean to people? So yes, the symbol of Herzl is still very much alive in Israel, although it's contested. And in North America, I think it is much more just a symbol of Jewish pride and of Jewish belonging. As Herzl himself wrote, we are a people, one people. And perhaps that's the most important thing that he means to Jews in diaspora.
And David, you've never really told us why you're obsessed with Herzl. How come you have 5,000 pieces about him. How come you wanted a film to be made about him, this collection? Tell us, what motivates you?
So I might be the subject of the film My Herzl, but it's really the filmmaker Eli Tal-El's story about his learning of Herzl and why he's important. And Eli, apropos the question that you started the discussion with about what people know and what people perceive Herzl to be, and myths about Herzl, and unraveling in the film is some of the truth about Herzl and the family situation that Shulamit talked about, and the notion that initially David Ben-Gurion wanted him to be perceived to be a superstar, which he was, but to be superhuman, with not foibles, with not any issues. But as you learn about Herzl's family, of course he had issues. And so to me, the point of the collecting of Herzl and talking about him and the Herzl program is that he's an inspirational person, not just for the founding of Jewish states, because we'll only have one, but for preserving and nurturing and protecting it. Also for preserving any dreams we might have. Because if you were standing in 1896 and when Herzl wrote the Jewish state and talked about a Jewish state, it was the most preposterous, ridiculous idea anyone ever had. And it happened within 52 years. So the point of the collection and the Herzl project and the movie and talking about it and all of us thinking about it is that the days of dreaming are not over yet. They'll never be over, and we can all be a little bit like Herzl to use our skills and talents. And Herzl was, as you heard, a playwright and a journalist and a lawyer, but he was smarter than me. He stopped practicing law early in his career, but he used his skills and talents to try and achieve something great. And he focused on the future of the Jewish people. And so we should all continue to be a little bit like Herzl and use our skills and talents towards making the world a better place. And as I said previously, Herzl's dream was not just a Jewish state, but building a model society in that state. That work is ongoing and will always be ongoing. And the point of the collection and the Herzl project is to inspire people not to throw up their hands to say it's too complicated, it's too difficult, we have elections every 4 months, whatever it might be, but continue to persevere like Herzl did, because amazing things can happen.
Well, what an inspiration this hour has been for me personally. And I can't thank you enough, my three fabulous speakers and our audience who comes week after week. So thank you so much and see you all next week. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.